So I'm gonna begin today with a brief land acknowledgement. So I currently live and work on the ancestral and traditional territories of the Niitsitapi, more commonly known as the Blackfoot, and the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation. And so today I'm going to be talking about one of my favorites, Roderick Haig-Brown, and my presentation is going to begin with an epigraph. So as a boy, I dreamed of fishing before I went, and went fishing before I caught anything, and knew fishermen before I became one. As a child, I dreamed of finding remarkable fish so close to me that they would be easy to catch, and no one in my dreams had ever found these fish before me. For one moment, I looked at the trout, and the trout looked at me. It seemed to be telling me something. I wasn't sure what. It is something I have been trying to hear ever since. And that's from David Adams Richards in the book Lines on the Water. There's an old angling adage that goes something like this. In the beginning, you just want to catch a fish. Any fish will do. Then you want to catch a lot of fish. Eventually, you want to catch certain species of fish. Maybe you even keep a life list like a birder does. At this stage, or maybe slightly later, you also want to catch big fish. Small fish simply won't do. So you only fish places where it seems likely you have a chance at catching big fish. Eventually, after catching enough big fish, you enter a place where you're just happy to be fishing. It's no longer about catching, though your experience probably means you still do plenty of it. Fly fishers add another layer of complexity to this angling evolution. For starters, in choosing to fly fish, you've already made the choice that you want to catch fish in a certain way. You've entered the realm of aesthetics rather than of purely utilitarian effectiveness. The fly fishing journey goes something like this. In the beginning, you just want to catch a fish on the fly. Any fish will do. Then you want to catch a lot of fish. Then you want to catch big fish. Next, you want to catch only wild fish, followed by native fish in their native watersheds. Finally, you're likely to make further aesthetic restrictions on yourself, such as only fishing with dry flies or only fishing on a swing. As Argyris notes, to fish well, that is, according to the rules laid down by tradition, while catching few or no fish is more desirable for the average fly fisherman than blind success with, say, a worm. Additionally, he argues that growing reverence for the prey must have accompanied the ritualization of its capture, and with ritualization, aesthetic considerations began to supplement, if not supplant, caloric ones. With each stage, the fly fisher sets new limits, and each limit amplifies the aesthetic intensity of fly fishing. John Gyrick outlines an additional evolution as well. He writes, "You keep the early trout. Anyone who doesn't is too saintly to be normal, but in time you begin to see the virtue of releasing the wild fish. The logic is infallible. If you kill him, he's gone. If you release him, he's still there." Next, Gyrick argues that at some point, your former values change ends. The bigger the trout, the more satisfying the release. Having all but lost your taste of fish, you begin to release everything. Wild fish, stalkers, stunted brook trout, whitefish, bluegills, with an air of righteousness that pains many of those around you. Eventually, things come full circle, and you come to realize that you have to kill some now and then, because this whole business of studying, stalking, outsmarting, and overpowering game is about death and killing. The dimension that Gyrick adds is ecological, rather than purely aesthetic. To kill a fish from time to time, to engage in that part of the ritual, is to reaffirm the human place in nature. My own angling evolution has been similar. I was probably around 4 years old when I first went fishing on Sturgeon Lake in northwestern Alberta in pursuit of walleye and northern pike. I spent many years catching as many fish as possible, often using bait to do so. I enjoyed countless childhood hours catching stocked rainbow trout from the pond a few blocks from my great-grandmother's house. I ate many of those fish, but wasted some. I got my first fly rod when I was around 11 or 12 years old. I fished with it and caught fish, though didn't really take to it until years later. It was as I entered adulthood, around 18 or 19, that I took up fly fishing seriously. I'm not sure what compelled me to do so. Maybe I was just ready to learn what I needed to. It was through fly fishing that I came to really care for and want to learn about Alberta, where I live. As I continued to fly fish, I learned about the local ecology of the Peace, North Saskatchewan, and Red Deer River watersheds, and all of the other fly fishing notions I've written and presented about in the past. It was after fly fishing that I took up catch and release, started using barbless hooks, and started caring about what happened to watersheds. And so, like when one wades into the river, we are left with the same sense of layered depths. That fly fishing alters one's goals and purpose over time, that fly fishers tend to make aesthetic rather than practical choices, and that as one gets deeper into fishing, one's relationship to ecology and non-human animals changes. There's clearly a journey, a development, a current that the fly fisher is drifting on. Looking at the literature of fly fishing helps us see the social, ethical, and aesthetic evolution of a culturally significant pastime. Fly fishing, I think, is often thought of as old-fashioned. However, in 2018, 6.9 million Americans fly fished. And fly fishing has the highest average annual growth rate among fly fishing, or among sport fishing categories, sorry. Fly fishing is not fading into memory, even if maybe some of the pipe smoking and tweed jacket wearing traditions are dying out. What that means is that fly fishers continue to be a culturally significant body of conservationists, and therefore that fly fishing literature is a body of texts worth studying for scholars of eco-criticism and sport literature. In the short film, Fisherman's Fall, made for the National Film Board of Canada, Roderick Haig-Brown invites viewers into the world of fish and fishing on his beloved Campbell River in British Columbia. Haig-Brown ruminates on the life and abundance in and around rivers, but 3 minutes into the film, things take a turn. Haig-Brown dons a snorkel and wetsuit and introduces viewers directly into the fish's world. Jason L. Rolfe notes that the observation of salmon and steelhead by river snorkeling is in no small way a legacy of Roderick Haig-Brown. Haig-Brown took up river snorkeling after he was well into middle age. In the middle part of the last century, he saw his beloved Campbell River in southwestern British Columbia dammed and witnessed the subsequent decline of the salmon, steelhead, and trout he loved. Rolfe also notes that Haig-Brown drew a sharp distinction between fishing and snorkeling, separation of his activities above and below water level. In the film, Haig-Brown says, sorry, I lost my place there. So he notes a separation of his activities above and below water level. There was a line there he did not cross. And this distinction is evident in Fisherman's Fall. In the film, Haig-Brown says, I turned to the mask and snorkel out of curiosity, wanting to know more of fish and water. I had no idea one would be able to move so freely or find so much beauty. The ethics of it concerned me a little. Should a fisherman be able to spy on his fish so easily? But I've decided I have a place here to watch and learn, but not to harm. In the book Fisherman's Fall, after which the film is named, Haig-Brown ponders the ethics of what he is doing. He writes that he has promised himself to kill nothing underwater and to disturb whatever lives there as little as possible. Additionally, Haig-Brown notes, it wouldn't seem right to watch the fish behind the dam through an afternoon and go out and catch them in the evening. But academic knowledge has its uses, and I have no reservations about applying what generalizations I learn underwater when I am back above the surface film again and fishing in the ordinary way. For Haig-Brown, river snorkeling provides another way of learning and immersing oneself into the riverine world, and while it may provide general insights, it, like fly fishing, is not simply a matter of utilitarian usefulness. In Current Affair, River Snorkeling as River Love, published in the Fly Fish Journal, Rolfe narrates his own first experience river snorkeling and reveals a sensibility similar to Haig-Brown's. Right away, I knew I wouldn't fish. It was the bull trout that did it. As we drifted over her through a deep pool on a small creek in the Central Cascades of Washington State, she hesitated. She swam first one way and then the other, as if unsure whether river left or river right provided the surest means of escape. She tried to retreat and swam several feet downstream ahead of us, but then she turned inexplicably and angled up into the current and rose toward us. I've never had a fish look at me. I've caught my share of various species and have even been lucky enough to fish for trout in other countries, but never in hooking a trout with a fly and lifting it above water to admire it, or in those rare times before cracking a hatchery salmon over the head with a rock and cutting its gills, have I ever felt that a fish was looking at me, that it was seeing me. Right. Additionally, Rolf writes that before he went snorkeling, he was intrigued by the possibility of swimming through a run or pool and going back with the knowledge he gained there to see if it could be applied to catching fish. However, that plan obviously went out the window with the sight of that first bull trout. It would seem that some boundaries just can't be crossed. In Why Haig-Brown Still Matters, Andrew Nikiforuk argues that Haig-Brown's bold and evolving critique of progress still makes him frighteningly relevant in a country violently addicted to resource extraction. Furthermore, Nikiforuk notes that in every respect, Haig-Brown was ahead of his time, noting that in 1959, 3 years before Rachel Carson published Silent Spring, Haig-Brown wrote about the disastrous effects of DDT on fish-bearing streams in Fisherman's Summer. Haig-Brown was an outspoken and important early Canadian conservationist whose beliefs in environmental conservation and critiques of corporate progress and resource extraction were outgrowths of his experiences as an angler. In Measure of the Year, Haig-Brown writes about all the things he has learned through fishing and watching fish. He notes that from a fisherman's point of view, almost everything about a river is related to fish and fishing. Haig-Brown goes on to detail the ways that floods, droughts, birds, predators, insect life, lime content, temperature, log jams, depth, trees, and the work of beavers and muskrats all have meaning in terms of fish and fishing. Haig-Brown argues that this may seem a narrow view. However, the interrelationships are so far-reaching and complicated that it is really comprehensive. If anything is not included, the fisherman is almost certain to include it because observation is one of the keenest pleasures of his sport. A deer seen by the waterside, a yellowthroat's nest at the edge of a lake, the burst of dogwood blossoms along the banks in springtime, the curve of sunlit water over a smooth rock. All these things are important to his sport as the fish themselves, and he does not pass them by. For Haig-Brown, perhaps most of all among fly fishing writers, angling is synonymous with learning, understanding, and knowledge. And with knowing, one loses the comfort and shield of ignorance. Whether that is enough to lead any particular individual to action depends on a great many things, but it is the start. Like the interconnected life of fish, fishing, and the ecology of a river, Haig-Brown argues that a conservationist fights many battles, varying in scale all the way from the attempted protection of some individual species of wildlife to the supreme issue of proper use of soil, air, and water. And every fight is complicated, if not forced, by the false urgency and outdated sanctity of progress. Thinking of Haig-Brown during his first experience river snorkeling, Rolf writes, I wondered if Haig-Brown had been unknowingly cogent of the way things would be. I wonder now if he had the sense, when he was snorkeling, that it was not simply a pastime, but possibly the future. Perhaps the last good way we might be able to interact with the declining runs of anadromous fish. Considering the threats to fresh water, and particularly cold water fish in the coming years and decades, such a sentiment is not out of the question. I too wonder what Haig-Brown would think of our current understanding of climate change and our overall inaction despite such knowledge. Perhaps the true future of fly fishing won't involve flies at all, but rather will involve us breaking the threshold of the surface film in search of a connection that gets harder and harder to find. To this end, Rolf adds yet another dimension to the old adage of the angler's evolution. Beyond catching many fish or big fish or only native fish on a dry fly, Rolf wonders if we might add to that the angler who no longer needs or wants to fish, who no longer requires a line and rod and fly in order to have his moment with the world beneath the water. I wonder if we might add to that the angler who simply wants to dive, to see life at water level, to swim with the fishes. If, as I've argued at previous SLA conferences and elsewhere, the purpose of fly fishing is to understand, to seek out technical mastery, and to connect with place, then this doesn't seem like an unreasonable idea. Similar in many respects, in Northern Waters, which was a focus of my presentation last year, Janzita Grover writes about the differences between her as a fly fisher as someone who has actualized herself as both an intellectual and embodied individual, in contrast to her father's devotion to purely intellectual pursuits. Grover writes, "Angling was not, I realized, a quest to score trophies or to rack up quantity. It was not about my father at all. It was about experience that lay beyond judgment, mostly beyond words, certainly beyond conventional concepts of time. I'd come to a mile marker my father had never reached, or I had failed to notice him reaching." It's possible that, like Grover, in comparison to her father, Haig-Brown and others have simply reached a mile marker most anglers never do. Thinking of this notion, I can't help but be reminded of Robert Macfarlane's introduction to the New York Review of Books edition of J.A. Baker's The Peregrine. In his introduction, Macfarlane writes, "The Peregrine is not a book about watching a bird. It is a book about becoming a bird." Likewise, in the endless pursuit of coming to know fish, perhaps, like Baker, the fly fisher attempts to transcend their human limitations. Macfarlane argues that Baker is hoping that through a fierce, prolonged, and purified concentration upon the peregrine, he will somehow be able to escape his human form and abscond into the brilliant wildness of the bird. And I can't help but think that Haig-Brown, in his life spent in deep observation and contemplation of rivers, was on a similar path. If I've learned anything from examining fly fishing and its literatures through senses of rhetoric, gender, ethics, and environmentalism, it's that the process is ongoing. The process of becoming better anglers and better stewards does not end. In the film Fisherman's Fall, Haig-Brown says, "Sometimes I dream of learning a river estuary completely, its movements, its wild creatures, its moods, everything. It's a nice thought, and there's no more pleasant way to spend time, but you could devote a life to it and end up only slightly wiser. The possibility of knowing completely is, I think, ultimately not an impediment, but an opportunity. The type of opportunity that led Haig-Brown beneath the surface when he realized the trout and salmon runs of Campbell River were dwindling. And still, wiser is wiser. Without a lifetime spent in angling and observation, it is unlikely that Haig-Brown would have taken that plunge, and unlikely that he would have become one of Canada's earliest and most outspoken conservationists. Fly fishers have learned many lessons, some of them painful, but fly fishing, like science, is a process. This is something Haig-Brown knew all too well, and it is a process that the fly fishers of today are still undertaking, inspired by writers like Haig-Brown. Heraclitus-like, he notes, "Tomorrow the river will look much the same, but it won't be. Everything moves and changes. No 2 days are ever the same for a fly fisherman." From what I've learned through studying fly fishing literature then, that the fly fisher, like the scientist, the philosopher, or even the literary scholar, is constantly learning and evolving, endlessly seeking to understand. Thank you.